Welcome to the August 2024 version of the France and Colonies Zoom meetings that we hold on the fourth Sunday of each month. If all goes well, we will have one in September with Ed. We will have one with Greg Redner in October, and then we will take November and December off for the holidays in the US and in December for the round the world holidays. Today, I am going to talk to us about Jan Kindler's Sower collection again, and it is what I call part 2 of the stamps. I would suggest to you that if you are staring at a screen that has the column of pictures over on the right-hand side, that you click the minus sign and get those out of the way, because I did not respect that corner of the screen when I put these slides together. So without further ado, I thank you all for being here this afternoon, and away we go. There's the stamp, and here's our program for today. I did the stamps themselves before, as you remember. Today it's the booklets, the coils, the semi-postals, the Annulé, overprint, and some other miscellaneous things, forgeries and what Jan called flim-flam, the military franchise overprints, and then finally the surcharges for Memel and Cilicia and Syria and so on. So that's where we're headed. In 1900, the French post office issued booklets that had the 10-cent Sower in them. It was a double pane, 10 stamps in each pane, 5x2, and they charged a 5 centime premium for the booklet, which you can see at the bottom, the 2 franc 05 for 2 francs worth of stamps. They were all the same size, and they were held together by a single staple. So here is a single booklet pane, and in 1900, these all were the thin lettering Sower. So the lettering at the very top and the word postus in particular, the C of the Centimes, all were very indistinct because they were what they called thin lettering. There is a listed variety where there's a contrast with the background, but that is not something that Jan pointed out in his material, if he even had one. These booklets had no marginal notations. I'm sure all of you know that later on, the PTT sold advertising space in the margins of these booklets. Here's the full double pane. You can see the staple in the middle, holding it all together. Then they hand stamped the booklet to reduce the price, to get rid of that 5 centime surcharge. So there's no longer a premium. This is now 1910, 10 years after the original booklets were issued. It's the same stamp pane inside. And there was if you look in the catalogs, there's a private 6-stamp booklet called the Belle Jardinière, which is not in Kindler's collection. It's a pretty expensive item. Then in still in 1910, I believe, I'm not sure, they simply reprinted the cover of the booklet, so they didn't need the hand stamp anymore, and now it just says the price is 2 francs. So if you're going to collect booklets thoroughly, you need the panes, you need the covers as well, similar to the United States. In addition, you saw the paper was kind of yellowish on those stamps. There was a white paper variety that they produced, and again, Kindler did not have an example of that. Now in 1910, they revised the stamp, the booklet stamp, to have the thicker lettering, and you can see the République Française and the word postus are both much clearer on these stamps than they were in that first booklet. Here's some color variations. And as I've told you guys before, it's very hard to see that with my scanner. You can at least see that on the left, that pale red stamp, the ink is quite mottled, as opposed to the solid background in the two on the right. Kindler was kind enough to put these artistic renditions in his collections, so I added them to the slideshow. When they printed these on GC paper, which was that crummy World War I era paper, cheaper to produce, I assume it was higher wood fiber content. The stamps actually are slightly different in those. Hold on, somebody's showing up here to the meeting. There we go. The stamps are slightly different in their design, so it was a different master die that they used. It's very hard to see. Kindler said that this was one of only 2 pieces known that were on this GC paper, but it's definitely the booklet style stamp. We have somebody else coming in. There we go. And the shading and so on, all of the characteristics of the booklet stamp are correct. It is not just regular stamp printing on GC paper. Here's another piece of a GC booklet. And I'll point this out here because we're going to need to remember this later. Notice that this is all comb perforation, not line perforation. All the holes in the corners line up perfectly. So in 1918, they produced a new booklet. They made a new die and they printed it on something called paper X. And it's on my desk here somewhere. I went out on the web. I think I mentioned this last time we were talking about papers. And I found a website that does, in fact, talk about these papers. I can't remember what search term I used, but it popped up the difference between type D, type E, the GC paper, type X paper. It has a description of all of this, and it's fortunately written in English so that I was able to understand it. Mentions the Bristol papers and so on. So if you are interested in this sort of thing, by all means, go out and Google it, and you should find it without too much trouble by asking for GC paper or paper X or something like that. A characteristic at this point is that they're printing with selvage on the left side because that's where they fastened the stamps into the booklet, which, oops, have to talk about the difference in the stamp. That separated tail on the Q is the giveaway for the 1918 booklet stamp. There's what the booklet looked like. And you can see even the hole in the left margin is on the cover as well as on the stamps themselves. And they put lots of stamps in these little booklets and sold them for 3 francs without any kind of a surcharge. And you can envision there's panes of 6 in this little booklet, and I didn't want to open it up and fold it back to scan it. You'll just have to use your imagination. Now, these were printed as 3 panes of stamps with 144 stamps on each sheet, but they were only 3 across, and it was 16 rows for each pane, 3 panes. So that added up to the 144 stamps in total. And you see how the salvage dots line up with the margins of the stamps top and bottom as well. And that was, I assume, how they guided them to get stapled appropriately, separated appropriately, and then stapled into those booklets so they all lined up. Here's a relatively rare piece, a partial sheet where you see the gutter middle. And it allowed, as I note there, it allowed stamp collectors to figure out how they actually produced these booklets in 1918, different from the way they did it in the past. So that's the end of the booklets for the Sower. And because the rates changed and so on, there just wasn't a demand for booklets after 1918. If you needed a 10-centime stamp, you could simply buy a sheet stamp. They also produced coils, and again, for those of us who have knowledge about anything related to French coils, they look like regular sheet stamps, except they are machine cut on the vertical sides, and you need to have, in the case of the Sower, 6 or more to prove that you have a coil, because the sheet stamps were printed in panes of 25, 5x5. If there's a 6th stamp, you know that it's a coil because it wasn't a 5x5 pane. And the longest strip is 15. Jan had a strip of 12 in his collection, which I've shown here. And the reason the scans aren't quite as good is because I didn't want to take them out of their protective backing, because the perforations are so fragile. These what are they, perf 14 or something like that. They just fall apart, this old paper. He also has a band that they use to wrap the coil. We see these in US collectors of coils as well. It's what we call the leader strip. There were 600 stamps in this coil, 60 franc value. And when it was wrapped around, it was glued, and then in this case, removed very carefully, since it's preserved very nicely. And I figured out, based on its length, that the diameter of the coil had to be about 1.75 inches or 4.5 centimeters, which would be about right for 600 stamps rolled up in there. He also had this used coil strip of 6, which is a nice relative rarity. Again, it's a common stamp, but to find a strip of 6 to prove that it's a coil use is very nice. Another rarity, the sheet stamps, as I said, are printed in panes of 25. The salvage was between the panes, and this is a coil issue because clearly there's 6 stamps in the column, each column, and there are 2 millésimes in the middle, one at the top and one at the bottom. Printed, that would have been in 1915. An even nicer piece, even though there's some stamps missing in the upper right corner, it's the bottom row of the printed sheet, where when they rearranged the stamps to print them as coils, those panes were separated by a stamp-sized row margin or salvage, and they simply rearranged the pane and shifted those 2 blank salvages to the bottom of the page. So they still used 75 images, printed 75 images on the left and 75 on the right, but it was continuous, 15 rows. Really curious piece. All right, the Red Cross issues. Only the 1914 millésime appears. These were prepared only 15 days after the declaration of war against France by Germany in 1914. And I will note that in my Spink-Maury catalog, the pictures of these 2 stamps, this and the next one, seem to be reversed, because this is clearly the first one that they prepared. There were 600,000 of them. It's the first French, what we call semi-postal in the United States, where there's a surcharge for charitable purposes. And it was in service for a little over 4 years. There is a variety with the so-called thin 5. Kindler had one of those in his collection. And there's some other catalog varieties that he did not have in his collection. Then they prepared a real stamp design for the charitable stamp for the Red Cross, as you can see in the margin, or on the right-hand side, rather. These were also issued in 1914, just a little while later, in use through 1917, although Spink-Maury say October 1918. It's the second French semi-postal, And as with the first one, the 5 centimes surcharge went to the Red Cross. They used this, or they printed this for several years. So there's a millesime for each of the years. And they put some of these on GC paper. They're considered scarce, but I don't know. I've seen them off and on over the years, but it's clearly not as common as the stamp on regular paper. They made a booklet of these redesigned stamps, and now you bought 20 stamps for 3 francs because of the 5 centimes surcharge, but they warn you that the postal value of the stamp was only 10 centimes. The stamp vignettes were slightly different than the sheet stamps. We don't know how many of them they made, but you can see it looks very much like the original Sower booklets that were issued for regular use. Here's an example of 3 stamps used on a cover. I suspect this went from a husband to his wife, and I looked up the little town. I couldn't find anything about them because it's kind of hard to run into that stuff on the internet. But I did find that this little town is now at least a bedroom community for folks who work in Monaco and choose not to or can't afford to live in Monaco itself. Onward, the annulés. Here's, before we get to them, here is an experimental paper issue. The one on the left on very thin paper. The one on the right, I can't remember. It may be on the same paper, but they were all sold as imperforate or disappeared out the back door of the printery, perhaps. We're not quite sure. Here's some more examples of imperforate stamps. And as I note here, this had to be from Jan's notes, that these were unauthorized backdoor items that came out of PTT and ended up in the hands of collectors. And these are all the heavier lettering, the more readable lettering on the 10 centime stamp. Here's the Annulé. These were first overprinted, which with a word that means canceled in French in 1911. And the reason they did this was they used the stamps to train their postal employees. So here's how to figure out how much to charge people if they buy X number of stamps. Here's what they look like on an envelope. I assume you could practice licking and sticking if you needed to, and so on. They did this again in 1923, 12 years later, for the same purpose, but they didn't use the 10 centimes Sower at that time because the rate was long since gone. So they didn't need to use the 10 centime stamp. They also did this for booklets, and these purple hand stamps are quite rare. Unfortunately, Jan did not have a complete booklet, but this is apparently what was left of one after the students played with it and learned how to properly sell them or tear the stamps out or whatever they did. Also, I'm sure most of you have seen this marking on French stamps. And colonial stamps, the reason for this was essentially to say, destroy this material. It stands out, as you know, when you see it, whether you find something in a packet or stuck in an envelope somewhere, it's very clear when you run across it. And they intended this stuff to be destroyed, but it just shows up in the hands of collectors from time to time. The reason for it could have been varied, whether it was a poor quality stamp, whether it was something they were just fooling around with and didn't intend to sell. The ink wasn't mixed well, so you had a crappy color. Any reason that would require destruction of the stamps. These examples in particular, you can tell, are not the right color. So that's, I assume, the reason these were marked for destruction. They also overprinted them with a rubber hand stamp. Rubber? I'm not sure if it was rubber or steel hand stamp for use as postage due. The T in triangle marking being well known to all of us. These were not issued to the public, but they did find their way out from time to time. And it was officially authorized, apparently, because during the war, they didn't always have postage due stamps available in all offices, but they would have had the hand stamp there to mark a letter that was postage due. That's all the miscellaneous stuff under the Annulé category. Now we go to forgeries. Come on. Next page. Now, I'm going to see if I can move it down here. There we go. All right, there was something that he called a pseudo thin line variety. And if you see that center stamp in particular, the letters again are relatively narrow. The original thin line is on the left, but the one in the middle is just, it's not the right one. It's entirely possible that it was just under inked or over inked that made it look like a thin line variety, but it really isn't. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a normal thicker lettering stamp, which is what the one in the middle should have looked like. I don't know if Jan was making this stuff up or not, truly, but it sounds good, so I threw it in. This is a color essay, and that's pretty true to the color of the real stamp. It's raspberry, as he described it, perforated stamp, but they should have put that hexagon cancel on it and burned it. But the 10 centime stamp was lifted from the PTT and apparently used to mail something. I've struggled to read the CDS on it, and the best I can make out is that it was sometime in the early 1920s that it got used. More fooling around. He says that all doubled overprints were privately made. There were no government errors. And there is a recognized inverted surcharge, but not an official government double surcharge inverted. So he considered these to be private forgeries, or again, printer's waste, somebody fooling around at the PTT, and this stuff coming out the back door or out of the dumpsters. Here's a forged FM, and if you look particularly at the F, the top bar there looks like this is probably a rubber stamp and not a steel stamp. And it's crooked. It is not square to the stamp design. So that gives you it's the giveaway that it's a forgery and not genuine. There's a guy named Lorulot who forged these. There are several who forged them. And if you look up forged Sower stamps on the web, again, you'll find a whole bunch of people listed on various sites. This guy in particular was busy in 1912, and he created pretty good looking forgeries, actually. He had 30,000 stamps in his home when they arrested him, and he only had to spend 6 months in prison for being a forger, which seems not unreasonable, I guess. This is a second forgery, and again, he's got the dividing or the bar across the salvage so that you can't produce or use that salvage to produce another stamp, even though all his were faked anyway. And this is where you can see that he had line perforations and not comb perforations. And that's the giveaway of many of these forged stamps. if you go, if you Google what I've written there, or if the hot link survives conversion to a PTT or YouTube recording, you can hotlink your way to this site, and it will tell you a lot more about forgeries of these Sower stamps. Encased stamps, just like we had in the United States, they were used as currency for a while in World War I. And as in the United States, it was usually a private organization that created these. So on the back of this one, there's a rubbing that Jan had in his collection for the Crédit Lyonnais. And there is more than one type, but I don't know that I found a catalog. I didn't look very hard, but I don't know how many catalog varieties there are. Another fun one, Mr. Grabowski ought to enjoy this especially. I like that they use WI as an abbreviation for West Indies. No value to the 20, no little C after it. So, but it's clearly a forgery. Then the PTT prepared these stamps because they thought at the beginning of World War I that they would just march into Alsace and recover the territory. And so they had a stamp ready to celebrate the occasion. However, it turned out to be well after World War I that they were able to take the territory back, and so these stamps were never issued. Kind of a cute Cinderella is the Sower in the middle of this frame. The Sower stamp, and you see the huge margin on it. The Sower stamp itself is only, as I say, 22 by 50 millimeters. It's very small, and the border is about the size of a stamp, or maybe a slightly larger stamp, like an American Champions of Liberty stamp. They prepared these and canceled them with a cancel that says we're raising funds to benefit blind soldiers. So it's a very cool little Cinderella item. Another, not really Cinderella, is, hang on, I got another person joining us. A genuine stamp sold on a piece of paper by the Galerie Lafayette, and they sold this as a souvenir, and I think the stamp was actually in this little envelope, so you would take it out and use it as postage if you chose to do so. This aged glassine allows us to see through. I can tell you I didn't open it and take it out. It's still sealed in Kindler's collection. A bisect used on cover and not charged postage due. The correct rate is 25 centimes to Switzerland. So it seemed to go right through, and we see the Geneva receiving mark. And again, not marked as postage due, so the bisect was accepted. And this is 1920, well after World War I. So that's the curiosities. And now we'll talk a little bit about the FM overprints. We know these were printed so that soldiers could mail their letters for free. The FM was applied first to the line sewers and then to the solid background sewers. They actually weren't required because the soldiers could just write FM on their letters and they would travel for free anyway. They used these stamps all the way till 1929, for 22 years, which is a heck of a long time. They printed and reprinted and overprinted. So they printed them all the way out to 1916 and skipped 1909. And they probably just had enough left over from 1907 and 8 that they didn't need to print them again. There are a few mentioned varieties. You can see the broken F marked with the arrow, the imperfect stamp, which may well have come out the back door, the the fading S in postus. If you remember, the Sower plates got tired after a while, and letters started to disappear, and the Sower's arms started to disappear, and so on. So we see some of those varieties with the FM overprint, and the inverted overprints in this case were genuine and recognized by the catalogs. All right. You'll start to recognize these too, I'll bet. The French Navy authorized overprints of stamps for Castle Rosso, and there were two varieties, one hand stamped on the right side, and then one that was done with a printing press on the left side. They moved in 1915 during World War I and did not give up the territory until 1921 when they gave it back to Italy. You have to really watch for fakes of the hand stamp, the stamp on the right side. And all of these were, according to the catalog, considered speculative and not done for any real postal purpose, other than I suspect the naval administrator was trying to avoid theft or to show his pride in being in charge of Castle Rosso for a while. They also overprinted or surcharged, in this case, stamps for Cilicia in Turkish currency, right, the para. And this Cilicia was ceded to France for a while, which is when these stamps were in use. And then in 1923, it went back, I shouldn't say back to, but it went to Turkey. There were several printings in 1920, and they also, this first issue has thin letters in the overprint, and the 20 and the para appear on the same line. Then they did it again in 1920, and this time they used thicker letters, and actually the O, if you look at it side by side, the O is a little rounder in this second surcharge, but it's clearly thicker letters as well, and the easiest thing to tell is the 20 paras is on two different lines. There are a couple 100,000 printed of the first type, 400,000 of the second type, and it has to do with the spacing between the Cilici and the 20. And a little more fun, inverted and the wrong value. And you can see on the stamp on the right that the word Cilici is now left justified instead of centered. So there's lots of fun stuff to collect with the OMF Cilici overprints. Here's the third one, and now they've added the abbreviation Sand Est, or the Eastern Country, or Sanjak. Again, just to differentiate that from, who knows, the Western Cilicia? I don't know, but they prepared these and then never issued them, but you'll find that they are available. Like 5 other major powers, France was granted a postal franchise in the Ottoman Empire before it was Turkey. And it was opened actually way back in 1812, and it continued through 1923, although all of these postal offices were closed during World War I. And I'm sure you remember German stamps. Wasn't Great Britain one of them as well? The Spanish were there. So there were a variety of countries, these half dozen countries that had postal services there. And France surcharged these stamps with Turkish currency in 1920, so after World War I. A different variety. He claims it was unrecorded. It's a narrower vertical spacing, and the 20 pairs is slightly narrower too. I can't imagine these things were forged because they're worth almost nothing as postage. So let's assume it's a genuine variety that just came out of the sheet and he was sharp enough to find it. In 1923, they hand stamped stamps for use as a provisional issue. It was authorized by the French consul, who was in the Levant at that time, and it was only for 5 days. And they had new stamps by March 31st. So 5 days use for these. I'm sure we'd rather see one on cover than just a loose stamp. They also surcharged the Sower, 10-cent Sower for memo.
We just dropped it.
And there was a whole set of stamps associated with this, of course, and there are several sets of Sower stamps. But this was specifically Jan's 10-cent collection, so that's the only one he has in his collection. Memo was detached from Germany by virtue of the Treaty of Versailles. The Allied powers governed it until 1923, and then the Lithuanians said, we're tired of this crap, and they marched in and nobody threw them out. So it became part of Lithuania in 1924. They printed a whole bunch of these stamps. They're, again, relatively common. I'm sure you could buy a set from a handful of dealers at any given stamp show. Then they surcharged them again because of inflation. It's now 1921. So the old 10 pfennig value now becomes 15. Then in 1922, they italicized the word memo and prepared another 140,000 stamps in Paris. They're a little harder to find than the regulars, the first set, but they are part of a longer set again. So if you want to collect these, I'd recommend you collect a whole set and not just the 10-cent. They overprinted the Red Cross stamp for sale in Morocco. So this came out in 1915. They demonetized these in 1921. The idea was you could mail a letter or a postcard from Morocco with one of these surcharged stamps. The same 5 centimes went to the Red Cross. Here's a cover that has full 25 centimes paid with these stamps. The R on there, I assume, was for registered service, recommendé, but there's no other postal markings on this envelope, front or back. So I'm not sure it ever actually went through the postal service, but if it did, it certainly was not treated as registered mail. Syria, one of the last places. The TEO was occupied enemy territory. It was a French mandate for 12 years after World War II, and they had occupied it before that, after World War I. And they created these stamps again for use just in Syria. Then they did a second value and a local reprinting in 1920. Again, you can see the tilted 2 was the giveaway, and there's a lot of minor varieties of this because they're fooling around locally and not doing it at the PTT in Paris. I think, oh, we're almost done. Here's an example of a misplaced surcharge. And a type 3 where they printed only 15,000 of these stamps and issued them in 1920. The Scott catalog shows this as a stamp that was issued before type 2, but Mari is pretty clear that it was a later issue rather than earlier. Here's type 4, again, a new different currency again, but it looks like all the others. He had an example of the 1920 millésime marginal pair or gutter pair, and like the others, there were a whole bunch of varieties. So here are some examples where he had a double surcharge, inverted, and in the left-hand stamp of the pair, it's an inverted S, which is one of those things that you really have to love your stamp collection if you want to go looking for stuff like that. And that's it. So I have walked us through the rest of the stamps in Kindler's Sower collection. And I have scanned, I want to say about 50 covers from his postal history section. I don't know if I'd call it postal history section, but I have 2 more folders here, roughly another 50. And some of these uses are fairly common, so I may not show all of them when I put the PowerPoint together. And I'm still undecided whether I'll make 1 or 2 presentations out of this, but I will continue this until I get all the way through because it's fun for me and I hope it's fun for you as well. So, questions, comments? Anything for the good of the order?
Can I just say something about the coils that you
ma'am.
I'm just thinking, you know, the minimum requirement, of course, as you correctly said, was 6 stamps if it was a flat plate printing, because in the sheets it would have been otherwise 5. But then, of course, the strip of 11 is only necessary if it is a rotary printing, because then you've got the strip of 10 in the sheet. So the 6 and the 11 are essential. But the one thing I would like to say is that those margins that you showed at the bottom of the flat plate printing, where you've got 2 rows of imperforated blanks, well, those are partly trimmed off because there had to be a small tab at the bottom of each vertical row, so they could be glued and overlapped to make a continuous roll. And it's always a joy to be able to find, I think what you called a coil join. I think I could just call coil joins. Are they in America?
Yeah.
Paste up.
A paste up. A paste up. Thank you. Where you've overlapped one stamp, and it had been done very dexterously. It was done by hand, so that the continuation of the reel was accurate around the bobbin. But certainly to see a sheet with those 2 rows of tabs was that is exceptional. And again, with the printing data at the bottom as well. Absolutely beautiful sheet, that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a shame the 2 stamps are missing, but you know what?
Okay. Yeah. No, that's beautiful. I mean, the paper itself looks absolutely pristine, doesn't it?
Yes.
Beautiful.
It's one of the few that I don't think has hinge reinforcements on the back.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Yeah. The other thing, if I may add, you showed a port timbre, the stamp collar. I think it was I put it down here. Yeah, World War I. It was the on your list of Cinderella. That tiny little stamp in the middle was from a children's post office, wasn't it? The Poste en Fontaine. I don't know if you mentioned that, perhaps I didn't hear you say it because I was reading and looking at the same time. Yeah.
I don't think I did mention it.
No, right. It's because in the last issue of the GB France and Colonies Journal, someone asked a question about Poste en Fontaine, and I wrote a couple of pages on it.
Oh.
And yeah, must be,
there it is.
Yeah, that is definitely Poste en Fontaine. And those are very collectible items these days. You'd be surprised at the prices you have to pay now for those little things. Yeah.
Yeah, this certainly wasn't the only one of these that was prepared.
No. No. I guess someone thought, well, we'll get a sheet of these from a little Poste en Fontaine outfit and use them to make these charities. It's absolutely great. It's most unusual. Most unusual.
Excuse me, it cannot be a French version. It's made in UK, because no French person would write Dieu protège la France, God protect France. It's out of the French vocabulary. At least in 1910, there was a law separating church and state. So you will never find Dieu protège la France in any French document at that time. It's a British document. That's
Oh,
why.
you think so? Right. Okay.
That's why we see God Save the King.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Because I mean, I collect the 50 centime Joan of Arc. I think I've shown it to you, and the 1929 issue. And yes, there was a lot of opposition from the anti-monarchists and the anti-clerical lobbies in the French government that such a stamp should be issued. But it was issued because it was not the outcome was they decided that the 50 centime Joan of Arc stamp was in fact celebrating something of a historical incident rather than religious or royal. But I'm sure I have seen port timbre in France with Dieu protège la France with the Joan of Arc stamp on. Someone basically, I mean, they're obviously privately printed and not government printed. And they simply they did get away with it. But I know that a lot of these port timbre were printed in Britain. Although I noticed that one had got déposé on the bottom, but again, any knowledgeable printer in Britain would be able to realise that it had to be printed on the bottom. But that's a nice, that's very interesting, isn't it, about the government's attitude towards religion and royalty in the early part of the 20th century. Because if you think later on in the 20th century, there were a lot of religious artifacts, images on French stamps. If you think of trying to think what the title was in France now, but we used to call them the art on stamps. Those very large stamps that came out in 1961 onwards. I mean, you had stained glass window in churches showing biblical scenes, and quite a change of policy there. So the secularism in France, in fact, did not overwhelm the production policies of the French Post Office. So I think those are some of the most beautiful stamps that France has ever issued.
For France, it's considered art, not religion. So we could print everything.
Yeah.
It's not religion.
No, it's art rather than religion. Fine, yeah. Yes, of course, art on stamps. Yes, yeah.
Any more?
Yeah, I've just been upstairs in my study to find my 3 timbre monnaie of the 10 centime. There's one from Credit Lyonnais, Société Générale, but a slightly more interesting one from an entity, Banque Jules Boutin, Dinard Travel Bureau. So I imagine that one's probably slightly more interesting than the other ones. They're in a desk in my study, not having found their way into any other part of my collections. But I knew I had them somewhere.
You have a good filing system.
On your discussion of the FM overprints,
Yes,
he may not have had them, but you also had some that were missing the period after the M, and also one with a larger dot after the M, and then an inverted overprint as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I don't, his stationery collection, he put a note that the title of it was a complete postal stationery collection. He did not do that for his 10-cent Sower stamp collection. Anybody else? All right.
If I can
Ed here.
Sorry. After you, Ed.
Well, if I was going to say, if you're done, I just like to do a slide of publicity for next month. Now that I found out, I was reminded that I'm speaking.
Why, sure. Let me let you share. Okay.
Okay. This is next month's talk. We're going to push philately into the background and talk about ephemera. But there will be some unusual French connections. And to stay in line with today's lecture, I'm going to show an FM overprint used from Chongqing to Paris, quite unusual. So the emphasis will be on ephemera, though, something very different, but with a fair bit of French material. So that's all.
Good. Good deal. And Ras should be sending out the invitations again, and he's going to have his own Zoom account for that meeting. And then we'll be back to my normal account in October. I'll be hosting again.
Okay, I'll try and remember to send him a copy of that title page. So
Good. Good. Yep. Yeah, I have the good fortune to be in Houston judging their stamp show at the time we're going to have our next meeting. So I'll still be doing stamps. It just won't be with the rest of you. All right. If that's it, I am going to first stop recording.